So we now go to the next presentation. And Marc Dewey is going to talk about what authors and reviewers think about introducing reporting guidelines and checklists in Radiology Journal.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Radiology is a leading imaging journal, and it's been a great pleasure to work with the editor-in-chief, the deputy editor, and with Patrick from Amsterdam on this project. And what we did is we looked at the guidelines and checklists in this imaging journal. And the background theme for us was the reproducibility crisis in science that we see. We see this in psychology sciences where p-values and results are not reproducible. We see this in surveys done by Nature in this situation where 90% of the researchers say, I have encountered this. I couldn't reproduce my own work or work from others, and it's a real issue. It also relates to clinical trials, and I'd like to highlight one presentation of Anwen Chan that's going to be in the next session. Actually, his presentation is published online today in JAMA, also showing the discrepancies between what is in the protocol, the registry, and the publication. And last but not least, also for cancer basic research, this is true, as we know from the Cancer Reproducibility Project, and it mainly related in this analysis to the quality of reporting. So this is what drove our project. And we looked at 4 guidelines and checklists in our analysis: STROBE for observational studies, START for diagnostic studies, and CONSORT and PRISMA for RCTs and meta-analyses. Could we get up the slides? Thanks very much. So we addressed 3 objectives. We wanted to know, and this is new, when are these checklists actually used by the authors? What is the impact on the manuscripts finally? And what is the perceived value as evaluated both by the authors as well as the reviewers? The rationale behind this project was the fact that the journal Radiology has endorsed these guidelines since their inception, but the editor-in-chief and the senior deputy editor, they were so brave to say in January 2016, from now on, this is a mandatory step in our review process. So with this paper, they introduced that all the submissions would have to include a guideline checklist before advancing the potential publication to peer review. So what we did in follow-up of this really brave step, we said, why don't we survey the authors? And we started that in July last year. We did it till June this year to meet the deadline of the conference. And one important point here is we sent out the request for filling the survey to the authors just after it was sent to peer review, but before making the decision about the acceptance. In order to get real honest answers from the authors, we also told them that we would never link their responses with the decision about acceptance or rejection. And only in this way, I strongly believe, you get honest answers from the authors. The limitation with that, of course, is we'll not be able to connect the quality with the outcomes of these papers. This analysis was approved by the BI, IRB. It received a waiver for informed consent. And it's really exciting to say that this conference is a super conference for peer review, experiencing the peer review that you do in this conference. The peer review that we received and these suggestions that we received actually led us to do something in addition. And thanks to Debbie Levine, I came up with the questions to reviewers. She programmed that. We put it online. We gave the reviewers of the journal 2 weeks of time to also get their perspective, because that was the request of the reviewers of the peer review conference, into this analysis. So what were the response rates of the authors and the reviewers? The authors responded in 60% of the time. And of course, if authors submitted more than one paper, they could be in this analysis more than once. That's for sure. The reviewers within this 2 weeks period respond almost 1/3. And the nice thing, and that shows that Debbie and Herb are really running a super journal, more than 200 of these reviewers responded within the first 24 hours after having received the request to fill the survey. So when are the guidelines used by the authors? Which guidelines are used first? STROPE is the overwhelming guideline related to the manuscripts that we receive in radiology. This is consistent with what is published. Diagnostic accuracies are very prevalent in radiology, and RCTs as well as meta-analyses are less common. So this is really reflecting with what is published. And when are these guidelines used? I show you some depressing results first. Only 15% use it when designing the study. And this is really nothing optimistic. And I will break down on the next slide per type of paper. And we were all expecting that, meta-analyses, RCTs, they'd be doing somehow better. Well, unfortunately, it's only the meta-analyses that have achieved to be, more than 50% of the meta-analyses using the guideline when designing their project. And to a great surprise, the RCTs used it on average only. Only 15% of the RCTs checked CONSORT before setting up a protocol and starting an RCT. So only 23% used it when writing the manuscript. We were hoping that would be higher too. And one-third did it when submitting the manuscript. And this is a learning experience author for authors of radiology that has endorsed these guidelines for long. Almost a third had to be requested by the office to send the checklist, which is mandatory since beginning of last year. And the important thing is the editorial office really enforced it in every single case. So since January last year, not a single paper, and I think this is new, no other journal did that, not a single paper got reviewed unless it had filled a checklist. So what was the impact on the manuscript when we look at the last three categories? So did it have an impact still when the office requested it? Did the authors change anything? And broken down for these three categories, you see the results here. So when you use the guidelines early on, when writing the paper, of course, it has a greater chance of having an impact on your manuscript. And only a third or every six influenced and had an impact on the manuscript when it was used later. What about the perceived value by authors and reviewers? The authors found in about a third and half to be this very useful new initiative or somewhat useful. So 80% very good. While the reviewers found it to be very useful only half of the time, mainly because only 1 out of 10 reviewers said, this is helpful for me to have this included. So on the next slide, I will show you all 268 comments that were made by the authors in the online survey. Just checking whether you're still with me. I selected very typical comments. And I'm showing you positive and negative comments. And the authors often said, that helped me a lot when preparing the paper. Or they said, for START, for instance, that helped us when we started the whole business. There were also negative comments. It may form the opinion that radiology is a tougher journal to get in. From the perspective of the reviewer, this may be a positive statement because, the perception of the journal is a high-quality journal. And others said, I don't think this is helpful. I know all this. I don't know how you can know, all checklists, but that was an important statement that was often made by authors. They also made recommendations for improving the initiative, such as including tripod, which is rarely used, but we, for instance, use it in our research, and why not having it included? The reviewers, the comments here explain why they look at this differently. They say it's mostly useful to the authors. It's not so much of use to us. But other reviewers also say, all right, we now included these guidelines and checklists when we go through papers in our journal clubs. However, they also said this is very time-consuming. It may have a huge impact on reviewing, but I don't know whether it's really helped. And the last point that the reviewers found is that they had the impression that some of the authors rather did a lip service, so they ticked all the items on the checklist, but when they checked whether this item was really present in the paper, they were not so convinced all the time. Another important comment to this group of mainly methodologists, from me as a clinician and a methodologist, maybe we should also consider shortening our approaches to improving quality and consistency, because that way they will be more often used in clinical practice and in research. In conclusion, 4 out of 5 authors and about half of the reviewers find it very useful or useful, the initiative that began at Radiology. However, we need to educate the authors on an earlier use, and there's 2 reasons for that. First, it has the greatest impact when you use it early, as shown by our analysis. But also 1/3 use it just when submitting or being requested, which clearly is too late to improve quality to a great extent. And last but not least, our next project that we just started is, of course, we want to understand what impact does this have on the quality of reporting in an analysis before and after. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, questions? Oh, we already have somebody. So please, there in the back.
Hello, I'm Justine from the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. I'm curious, how long it actually added to both the reviewer and the author times? Did you have a sense of that?
No, we did not ask. We had some comments from reviewers who said, I look at it for 1 to 2 minutes and make sure that the tick boxes are really in. So this is probably the time you can expect from reviewers. If we finally achieve that the authors use it when they start the project, you know, really reading the guideline and the elaboration on many of these guidelines will take days and weeks to get this into your research project. But we didn't ask them.
I'm just curious because the reviewer burden is something we hear about all the time, and I noticed that only half of them found it useful. So I was just curious about that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Thais from Brazil. Congratulations on your work. I'm just a suggestion, because you told that one of your questions was that if the person used the reporting guideline when planning the research, when designing the research, and it can be useful, but usually we would request them to follow the methodological suggestions in the field. And also, in some areas, there are reporting guidelines for protocols, just like PRISMA protocol and the SPIRIT, and maybe the other final report protocol would not be very useful.
Yeah.
Chris Papazian, I'm chair of the Department of Biomedical Sciences at UMKC School of Medicine, but the reason I'm here is I also go around and teach people how to write high-impact research manuscripts for an organization called Grant Writer Seminars and Workshops. And I've been doing that for a number of years, and one of the clients, the groups of clients that we utilize the most, that utilize our services the most, are institutions that have CTSCs. And we'll have a fairly large audience in those institutions, and I very often ask how many people are involved in clinical trials, and then I'll ask them, do you know about the consort statement? And almost nobody knows about the consort statement, and almost nobody knows about the Equator Network. Now, these are individuals in training primarily at this point in time, but you would think if they're involved in clinical trials, they should have some knowledge. So clearly there's a lack of awareness out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah. Well, then there is Equator. Question there.
Thank you.
Doug.
Doug Altman from Oxford. Thank you for this study. It's really interesting, and I think we need more such studies trying to find out how people do things and how they react to it. And you said you're going to look at some impact in some sense, which is great. I just wanted to say that we did a study relating to the remark guideline for reporting biomarker studies. We identified 50 papers which cited the guideline and matched them to 50 papers in the same journals that didn't cite the guideline and compared the quality of reporting, and we found no difference, which was both disappointing and puzzling. And so I hope perhaps your work could shed some light into that. But have you looked at whether people cite the guideline they've used?
No, we have not. And the important limitation here is, and that's why I believe we got honest answers, we didn't link with the paper and its outcome. So we are not able to link the answers here with the real report, which of course increased the availability of honest answers, but we'll make this part of our does it have an impact analysis to check whether it was cited and what's adhered to entirely. Great proposal. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Okay, another question there, and then the last question over there.
Hi, Juno Shiro, a Mayo Clinic. In my work, I'm a manuscript editor, so I see the drafts before they're submitted to the journals, and I review all the journal's instructions for authors. When I know a guideline is required at submission, I always go back to the author and I say, hey, by the way, you have to do, all these things. And almost everything that you presented today is like completely in line with my anecdotal experience. People are not aware of guidelines. They perhaps just give them lip service. They don't make major changes to their manuscript. And for a while, I was sort of grading them, and I'd be like, okay, is item number 3 here? Is it really on the page, that they said it is? And it was becoming a very tedious project. And so at some point I said, you know what, I'm gonna let the author take responsibility for this. And again, this is just my anecdotal experience, but I don't think anyone is grading them in the same way. They just look to see, oh, somebody looked at the checklist, the page numbers are there, must be okay. So I guess I'm just wondering, is that the burden on the reviewer to look at that, or is the journal just sort of assuming that if you've submitted the guideline, you're probably following it?
So considering the number of 3,000 submitted papers to radiology and the ones that are really in need of adhering to a guideline is probably about 1,000 or more each year, there's simply no capacity to do this in the office. It would be fantastic. It's clearly not a request that was posed on the reviewers to check this item by item. Because time is really money also for reviewers. But we made them aware that it's in there as a new tool to be used, but we didn't request them. I strongly believe that we need to make more use of machine learning. So this is in the field that I work in, radiology. This is the topic, and we include this in our basic and our applied clinical trials. To improve the automated analysis with higher consistency. And this is one of the things I take home, being here for the first time, that we should consider doing this also more in this field. It may help.
Thank you very much.
Good idea, thanks. And one question there.
Kirsten Patrick from the CMAJ. So I'm intrigued by this and by your presentation because I really think that we as editors feel this responsibility to get people to use the guidelines, but it's not our job, it's theirs. It's their responsibility much, much earlier on in the process. And speaking to the question about citation of guidelines and there not being a difference, I believe that editors play a strong role if they're interested in the question of a manuscript in bettering the reporting. There are some, if we're not interested in the question, we don't bother to help people improve their manuscript. So my question is, how do we find a way in our workflow to get people to think about using the checklists much earlier in the process?
So I think it would be important to show them also the benefit and continuously use this as a learning experiment. Because we learned from this initiative that it takes longer than 6 months to make really everybody understand, the rules changed. Our authors have other stuff to do than check the author information of all the journals that are around every 6 months. So they, only if they submit a new manuscript to the journal, they learn this. So it's a learning experiment, and of course, the great reviewer, the great editors, once sitting left to me, you could really feel from Hal Sachs' comments when he was taking care of papers, how much he was into that and really prescribing you of what to add to the next revision, because there were, of course, several, not only a single one. And this is definitely also very important. In addition to what I said before, so machine learning should not kick off the editors and the deputy editors, but it should be something that we could deeply consider in making things more consistent and applicable to the huge number and ever-increasing number of submissions that we also see.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.